to introduce our keynote presentation for this morning. I am just thrilled to have this keynote. This is Your Brain on Food with Dr. Naidoo. She is a Harvard psychiatrist who has studied nutrition, and she's also a trained professional chef. So what a combination. She is going to be joining us now. Welcome, Dr. Naidoo.
Thanks so much.
We have people joining us on Facebook Live. So we're going to share a link. If you're watching us on Facebook Live, you can register for the event still to participate in a Q&A with Dr. Naidoo at the end of her session. So Dr. Naidoo, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Thank you so much, Maggie. I appreciate that, and I appreciate being here. I'm just going to screen share right now. Great. I hope everyone can hear me. Welcome to today's talk, and I'm very excited to hear a little bit more about the results of the survey that you put out about who knows about nutritional psychiatry, because as I will go through my presentation, you will understand that the term is more nascent, but the work has been going on for some time. The work that I'm doing was actually really put together in my book. It's based on my clinical work and clinical science research at Mass General, at Harvard Medical School. And the book in the US is called This Is Your Brain on Food. But if you are tuning in from the UK or other countries, the same book is just called The Food-Mood Connection. This is who I am. I had the opportunity to begin and start, as well as found the Nutritional and Lifestyle Psychiatry Service at Mass General Hospital in Boston, which is the largest teaching hospital at Harvard Medical School. I was deeply honored to do that with an opportunity to bring my views on food as medicine to the clinical world. And it really solidified my role as a nutritional psychiatrist over time. I also authored this book, which was released in summer of last year. And as Maggie kindly mentioned, I do a few other things with my life, which has brought me really to the niche and nexus of this work. And I feel very fortunate that I arrived at this point and can share my work with all of you. This is for all of you who are not in Boston. This is where I hang out when the world is not in a virtual mode. This is kind of where I'm based in the world. So let's start with what is nutritional psychiatry. Nutritional psychiatry offers clinical guidelines based on nutrition science and evidence-based research for the use of healthy whole foods and nutrients to improve mental well-being. An important disclaimer to mention here is that this does not exclude the use of medications. In fact, medications have saved the lives of many of my patients. So as a practicing nutritional psychiatrist, I also prescribe medications in certain situations. And in some consultations, I work with other practitioners who prescribe medications, but I will work with other nutritional components of that nutritional psychiatry treatment plan with an individual. So very important to understand that one does not exclude the other, and that foods are really a very important additional treatment and tool in the toolkit of anyone who wants to improve their mental well-being. You really don't have to fit into a box of diagnosis. And what do I mean by that? In the United States, we use a classification system called DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. And my issue with it is that we do use it, and as a prescriber and practitioner, I use it as well, but it does not cover every single human being. There are many individuals who do not simply fit the check boxes of the diagnostic criteria, but are suffering in some way. And I really feel that nutritional psychiatry fills this gap for individuals who may be functioning in their day-to-day life. COVID is a perfect example of that, as I will go into later in my talk, but who may not need or want medication, but be able to use nutritional and other lifestyle strategies to improve how they're feeling. An interesting point is that my work was featured in the Wall Street Journal a few years ago. And if you've ever spoken to a reporter, they're just wonderful human beings who know how to synthesize information. I had a wonderful conversation with a young woman who wrote this article. And in the article, what she quoted me, one of the quotes she made was, nutritional psychiatry is not about 10 milligrams of Prozac or 10 blueberries. And it's really always stuck in my mind because it's a way to convey to people that it's not about replacing a food or nutrient or replacing a medication. It really is about trying to find other therapies and, rather than enhance and offer a broader option to improve mental well-being. So it's not, 10 milligrams of Prozac or 10 blueberries. It's just a way to think about it. So today what I will cover in this half hour will be what is different about the pandemic and the food priorities. I'd like people to understand the gut-brain connection. Some of you may be very familiar with it and others may not. And can food make a difference to mental well-being? Given that this is a half-hour talk, I'm really going to give a very general and broad overview and like people to understand that, there's much more information in my book, but also there's much more information that people could access if they are interested in this kind of work. But a half hour is obviously not going to be enough to cover everything. So I would say that, the first thing we need to look at is that in the US, there has been a tremendous amount of COVID data that has come out and that is still ongoing. I would say that in March of last year, 2020, the American Psychiatric Association did a survey and showed that most Americans were very concerned about uncertainty. That, I would say, has now continued and persisted into this time. And while the vaccine is out and there are very many positive things on the horizon, there's certainly uncertainty about quarantine, closures, new strains of the virus, etc. So I would say that uncertainty remains on our minds. Then other data that came out during last year, which is important to understand in terms of mental well-being, and therefore in terms of our nutrition, is that there was a sudden bump in prescriptions for anxiety, depression, and insomnia medications, which was conducted by a survey by Express Scripts. And these were, by the way, new prescriptions. There was a significant bump. Then in June of 2020, there was a shortage of one of the most highly prescribed medications in the United States, an SSRI medication called Zoloft, otherwise known as sertraline. This medication went on shortage in June. The other important factor related to COVID-19 statistics is that the CDC revealed some data in the summer of 2020, and one of the most concerning things it showed, there was an increase in depression, there was an increase in anxiety, but 11% of Americans considered suicide. And that was very scary as a functioning and practicing psychiatrist to think about what was really on the minds of people and what they were struggling with. I'd like to also just share that, there's the fact that people are quarantined or working from home does not exclude the fact that people in general are feeling burnt out. This particular study really looked at the second wave of burnout, and it showed that when people are feeling burnt out, that they have specific symptoms or specific things that they reveal in their work life and their home life. And those three things were shown to be cynicism, exhaustion, and decreased personal effectiveness. And I think that it's just important to understand that if you have any of those emotions or seeing that in a colleague, a family member, or friend, to consider that that individual, for whatever reason, just within the context of this ongoing pandemic, may actually be burnt out. Why is burnout important? Because stress, burnout, anxiety, depression can all be addressed by adjusting how you feed your brain. And that is what ultimately we want to try to think about and talk about. So why brain foods? Well, because there is the emerging evidence over the last 2 decades on the gut microbiome, which we will talk briefly about, and the fact that food can actually therefore make a difference. It's beyond, and I also think that the other niche that nutritional psychiatry fulfills is that we go in to see our doctors and have conversations, whether they're virtual visits now around a family history of diabetes, medications for hypertension or an elevated cholesterol, or even some extra pounds that someone may have gained during the pandemic. So we'd be talking about many things with our doctors, but we are never talking about our brain. We're never talking about our mental well-being and how it may relate to how we are eating. And when nutrition is touched upon, there tends to be a gap also in the nutrition education that doctors have, because our medical schools, not all our medical schools, fulfill the criteria of really educating doctors around enough nutrition. So I would say that, it's important that we understand when we're having these conversations that we are not talking about how our brain may be impacted by the food that we eat, and it's an important conversation to be having. Now, I would argue that it is important because the brain is really body royalty. In medical school, we study neuroanatomy, and one of the things we learn is that the brain essentially controls everything in the body. So if your brain is not working, your body is not working. So, in an average adult human, the brain represents about 2% of the body weight. Yet, despite its relatively small size, the brain accounts for about 20% of the oxygen and hence calories consumed by the body. And it consumes about 20% of some glucose derived energy. So, while it is a small organ, it is a powerful organ. And as a psychiatrist, and specifically as a nutritional psychiatrist, I think that how we eat and what we eat in terms of healthy whole foods becomes really important to our mental well-being. And I will say and add that when people are paying attention to how they're eating and they start to feel emotionally well, their physical health naturally improves as well. I've seen this time and time again with my own patients. So what is the brain-gut or the gut-brain connection? It is essentially the fact that the gut and brain are inextricably connected. And they are inextricably connected because embryologically, when our bodies are developing in the embryo, the gut and brain arise from the exact same cells in the body. They then divide up and reach different parts of our body. So most people might think, well, how could they possibly be connected other than being in the same body? Number one, they are derived from the exact same cells in the embryo. Secondly, they are connected throughout our lives, and I'll show you a slide in a little bit, by the 10th cranial nerve called the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve connects the brain to the gut and the gut to the brain, and I call it a two-way superhighway. Why? Because it works 24/7, it never shuts off, it is continuously sharing messages between the gut and brain and the brain and gut. And that becomes really important to understand that when food is digested, it definitely impacts the environment of the vagus nerve in the gut. The third thing is that, like I mentioned, Zoloft is a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. There are several of those medications. Brand names for those medications include Prozac, Paxil, Lexapro, and Celexa. Well, all of those medications act on what many people call the happiness hormone, serotonin. But more than 90% of serotonin receptors are located in the gut. Again, bringing this connection of food and the brain closer to our understanding. A fourth and other very significant fact for us to understand is that, especially in pandemic times where immunity is even more crucial than usual, a large component of our immune system is in the gut. So we need to understand that how we eat is also impacting our immunity. I would just say that, a long time ago, the father of medicine, of modern medicine, Hippocrates, said that all diseases begin in the gut and death sits in the bowel, indicating to us that us newer clinicians, may be talking about this now, but he had hints of this a very long time ago, that the gut is such a central component to illness. And I would argue that some of the components around modern disease include some items such as insulin resistance, inflammation, and oxidative stress. And all of these do impact the gut microbiome and the gut-brain axis. So when we think about this connection between the gut and brain, we spoke about embryology. We covered the fact that anatomically there's this connection between the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve connects the brain to the gut and the gut to the brain. But also there neurochemically that within this environment, there are chemical signals sent between these two organ systems. And pathologically speaking, there are conditions such as, for example, if you've heard of Parkinson's, which I know all of you have, sometimes an unusual presenting symptom is constipation. And constipation, of course, affects the gut. So it's just a good reminder to understand that there are many things that are related to this gut-brain connection. As I promised, this is the anatomical diagrammatic formation of really showing that the vagus nerve, as labeled here, the yellow in yellow, is that 10th cranial nerve connecting the brain directly to your organ systems of the gut. The light pink squiggly part is your large intestine or colon, and the smaller, longer areas in the deeper pink are your small intestine. I'm sure many of you have seen this before. I won't assume that you haven't, but just by way of explanation, this connection is very real, and it does have an implication for our health. So when we come to the gut microbiome, I would say that what's important to understand is that there are probably about 100 trillion microbes that exist and live and are alive in the gut microbiome. I say microbe and not just bacteria, because bacteria is one of approximately 5 different species of organisms that live there. And the whole opportunity for us to adjust our nutrition and how we're eating really becomes about how this impacts the gut microbiome. So these organisms live there. And scientists have said that, the size of all of these 100 trillion organisms are approximately the size of an avocado. They don't exist like an avocado because they're all in that environment and it doesn't look like an avocado, but just by estimation or guesstimation, it's a way to help people understand that these organisms are minute. So microscopic and minute. So you don't see them in that way. However, what's important for us to understand about this is that these organisms really form such a huge component of our health system now. Given that those 3 components I mentioned, which in my opinion are really the basis of our health issues in current times, insulin resistance, oxidative stress, and inflammation. So I think that, just understanding that these microbes exist in the gut and that how we eat impacts them. And it also then helps us understand that what you eat changes these gut bacteria or these gut microbes. And this is one of the reasons that the gut is now being called the second brain. And when gut bacteria change, the signals to and from your brain change as well. Another factor to mention in this understanding is that in a 24-hour period, research has shown that our gut microbes can change. So you may decide today to have a fast food meal, eat some junk food or some processed food, or you may decide on a healthier option. And in that 24-hour period, your microbes will change. You will not experience it immediately, but you will begin to influence the environment of your gut microbiome. And over time, if you've chosen the fast food meal, the junk food, or the processed and ultra-processed foods, over time, what will happen is it will start to set up the process of inflammation in your gut. However, if you chose that healthier option and meal, it will impact your gut microbiome in a positive way. And I think that it's important to understand what dysbiosis is, which we will touch on in a moment. So remember, in a 24-hour period, your gut microbiome and what the microbes are doing in your gut environment can be changed by how you eat. And you may not feel it immediately, but note to self that over time, maybe weeks, it may be a month, that type of continued, maybe poor eating or healthier eating can improve your gut microbiome or start to cause inflammation. Now, I would say that, with selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, medications which I've touched on a few times now, the fact that the receptors, more than 90% are in the gut microbiome, make a difference. I'd also say that they are medications which can be life-saving, but at the same time, they have some side effects. And one of the things that when I prescribe such a medication, I will speak to individuals about is that the first 7 to 10 days, a person may experience some gastrointestinal discomfort. And why is that? Well, it's because we know now that the receptors are in the environment of the gut. And it becomes important for people to understand that in the context of taking a medication, as well as the potential for side effects. Now, what does the gut actually do? And I'm again going to touch this in a very cursory way to help us understand that the gut has such an important function for us, and a healthy gut therefore becomes important in how we function. Some of those things include breakdown of complex carbohydrates, production of vitamins and nutrients. They also produce very important short-chain fatty acids, which become extremely important in this mood-food connection. They also protect us against pathogen. It helps to train the immune system, supports detoxification, and also modulates the nervous system. So this is one, these are 7 or 8 of the many, many different functions that a healthy gut does for us. So the gut is not just a place where digestion occurs. It is now, this part of our body that has become so much more important in understanding our physical health, as I mentioned, but also in terms of my work in nutritional psychiatry, our mental well-being. So, in regard to dysbiosis, which I touched on earlier, what may definitely happen to an individual is that they start to perhaps eat poorly. Perhaps during the pandemic, things have been more difficult. There have been so many changes to how we eat during the pandemic. I would say that this might be a good time to touch on the fact that at the beginning of the pandemic in the United States, processed food sales were at an all-time high. People, for the first time, were seeing well, I shouldn't say for the first time, but after a very long time, seeing some supermarket shelves that were empty, and there was a sense of panic. So many people went out and bought processed shelf-stable foods because that was at least a feeling that you would have food in your pantry. And I think that where this impacted us significantly was that how we ate and how this impacted our physical health really did change as well. And the point that I'm trying to make is not that, we should beat ourselves up. It's really the fact that we should make these observations about how we eat. And this is the type of thing that can potentially lead to dysbiosis or that imbalance in our gut. Dysbiosis, very, very simply said, is when you think about the environment of all of those microbes, the bad microbes take over the good microbes. So when you're feeding your microbiome and feeding yourself less healthy options, the poor microbes or the bad guys take over the good guys and basically start this process of inflammation in your gut called dysbiosis. And over time, this can lead to conditions that people have heard called leaky gut, which is intestinal permeability, because the lining of the gut is one single cell layer thin, and it is very delicate. So think about the fact that it can easily be disrupted through how we eat. Now, some research in probiotics, for example, just to bring the point home that this is linked to our mental well-being. Research in probiotics showed that they were very effective in lowering anxiety and depressive symptoms similar to traditional prescription medications. And this is just a study that I'm touching on that shows the role of inflammation, which I've been speaking about, because essentially dysbiosis or an imbalance of bad and good bacteria or good microbes in the gut leads to inflammation. And the gut microbiome therefore becomes associated with symptoms of depression and anxiety. This was a study from 2019, and I think is significant in helping us understand this connection. So that begs the question, how do we now create a sense of balance in terms of how we eat and what we do and what are useful treatments? So as a mental health practitioner, the first thing I would say is that, remember, it's not just about a medication, it's not just about nutrition, and it's not just about forms of psychotherapy, all of which are very, very key. I would actually argue that it's much more of a holistic model, which I will share in a little bit, but it is about all of those things: how you eat, how you sleep, are you exercising, are you drinking enough water, or what are you drinking for liquids during the day? Are you eating fruit and vegetables? Are you making sure that you have enough fiber in your diet, which is critical? In this country, we tend to be concerned about protein, but it turns out that most of us are deficient in our fiber needs for the day. So it's about creating a balance of treatments that are useful for your physical and your mental health. Now, studies in terms of medications have been consistently showing that not everyone is completely healed of a mental health condition when they are prescribed a medication. In fact, a study published in 2015 showed that about 50% of individuals with anxiety actually heal of their symptoms or show significant improvement. But there are very many people that do not fully improve. And clearly what this speaks to is a concern for more tools in our toolkit to help us feel better. That's the one point. I think the other point to mention is that it's really not just about the medication, it's also about mindfulness, using, breathing techniques, using movement, but not just exercise and, getting in 150 minutes of exercise a week. It's also use of things like Tai Chi, Qigong, other methods or yoga, other methods of calming down your body, but also engaging in movement that could be calming and helpful to your body. So it's not just about medication. And just to make the point that research studies of medication trials do not necessarily show that everyone reaches remission. So this brings me to how I practice and why I feel this model of care is important. Based on my background as a South Asian, I always grew up in an environment of meditation, mindfulness, yoga, and really some practitioners in my family who also practiced Ayurvedic medicine. So my philosophy has always been holistic. I also believe in an integrated form of psychiatry that looks at a functional approach. And what do I mean by that? By integrated, I mean all body systems. I mean that I work with practitioners across all disciplines to understand a person's physiology, to understand their pathology, to understand what may be going on in their body so that I can better treat them. Because the downside of an amazing medical system like we have in the United States, and I have worked in other countries, so I can easily provide testament to the fact that we do have an excellent medical system. Well, every medical system can improve. I think the one downside is that it is so highly specialized that clinicians tend to be siloed. And we make every effort to communicate effectively. But I think that what sometimes is missing is an integrated approach to the individual patient. And by functional, I mean that I look for the root cause of what someone might be experiencing. For example, I had a patient who presented to me desperate to get a prescription for a medication such as a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, because for the first time in her life, she was feeling anxious. And at that point, she was referred to me by her gastrointestinal physician. And after a further investigation, testing, and also asking her full history, I realized that her lifestyle had changed. Her food and intake of nutrition and what she was eating and drinking changed because she had a promotion at work. And for that reason, she was eating many more processed foods and fast food meals rather than preparing meals at home. And over time, over approximately 18 months, that exact example of dysbiosis or inflammation in her gut had been set up. Her balance of her chemicals was really out of balance, and she was starting to experience severe anxiety for the first time in her life. What we did eventually do was work with her on a nutritional psychiatry plan, which healed her gut over time and reduced her symptoms. Now, I just wanted to touch briefly on some of the research. And again, there's, a ton of research that's been done. The end notes in my book are extensive, and as I said to the team earlier today, it's really meant to be a guide and a reference so that an individual who may be a scientific researcher listening to this, or clinician, or someone who is reading the book and is interested to know, well, how come Dr. Naidoo is saying this about gut bacteria? The references are there for you to look up and to read if you're interested, because I think it's really important to understand where we are in terms of nutritional science in our research, and that it evolves and changes all the time. And I would just say that nutritional science and nutritional epidemiology, our research is not as well funded as big pharma. So trials of, the most recent psychiatric medication may take billions of dollars, but nutritional science and nutritional epidemiology is not nearly as well funded. So a small study may still be effective, and it's important to understand where we are at with the research. Historically, though, what I wanted people to understand is that many things that have been researched over time have actually included things like methylfolate, vitamin D, magnesium, omega-3 fatty acids. But I feel that, what nutritional psychiatry has done is brought this together like we eat a plate of food. I think that anyone listening to me today knows that we don't eat one single ingredient. We usually eat a composed plate of food and a dish. And in that way, I would just, use the culinary example of nutritional psychiatry brings together the studies, the information of nutrients, individual items, and puts it together on a plate and helps people understand an improvement to their mental well-being through this way. So some of the research that I wanted to touch on today were just a couple of studies, remembering that there are many more included in my book. The one I would first speak about is the SMILES trial, which was a study completed in over 12 weeks, and it was a trial of dietary intervention to treat moderate to severe depression. The trial involved 67 participants and compared the outcomes when treated either with a high-quality diet with minimal processed foods or with a social support group. And the levels of depression were assessed using depression rating scales. The dietary group had significantly greater improvement from their baseline mental health than the social support group. And the conclusion of the study was that dietary improvement may be an effective and accessible method of treating depression. So even though there were 67 participants, obviously the study recruited a lot more. But, again, the context of the study, the way in which the study was done, all become important. And like I said, with nutritional science and nutritional epidemiology, sometimes the studies are slightly smaller. The next study showed, was basically investigated the link between the Mediterranean diet, which essentially is a high intake of whole plant foods, extra virgin olive oil, moderate fish intake, low intake of meat, and it looked at levels of depression. The study consisted of 152 adults with a 3-month and 6-month assessment, and one group was instructed to eat a high-quality Mediterranean diet and fish oil supplements, while the other continued with their baseline lower quality diet and had social support groups. The conclusion of the study was that it supported other findings that dietary intervention can be a therapeutic approach for those with depression, and the highly unprocessed Mediterranean diet is associated with improved symptoms of depression. So, that becomes important for us to understand in terms of what to eat and what not to eat. And one of the things I think is important for people to understand is the foods that are generally offenders in our diet. And can we suddenly give up all of those foods in one day? No, it's really about a slow and steady change, moving from whatever point you are at, and I include myself in this dynamic as well, to a healthier form of what you're doing. Foods that we want to be cautious about are fast foods, processed and ultra-processed foods, trans fats, which have actually been associated with aggression in clinical studies, added sugars, refined grains, cereals, which are also highly processed and sometimes have a lot of added sugar in them, processed meats, sugar-sweetened beverages, and generally, what we consider to be junk foods. And examples of these are contained in the slide, and I know that you will get a follow-up copy of my slides, so you will be able to read that at length as well. And one other point I would make here is that I would like people to start paying attention to food labels. I know that I'm preaching to the choir here. All of you are highly aware of these types of things. But, for the average consumer, and certainly for my patients, they really need to understand that plant-based in a label does not mean that it's the healthiest option. It really goes to the ingredients, the actual sugar content, what's added to that. Are there processed ingredients, stabilizers, colorants, and dyes? A whole grain cereal may have a ton of added sugars, so it's really the content of what's in it that becomes important. Natural on a food label does not imply the healthiest option either. And educating people about what an organic food label means and what a whole grain label means becomes important. So there are many things that are touted out there in food labels, which fall within food labeling laws, but actually do mislead the consumer. And I try to make sure people understand what they're looking for and also what they're eating when they consume something. So it turns out that only 1 in 10 of people in the US are eating our fruits and veggies. And this becomes important because one of the pillars of my work in nutritional psychiatry is eating the rainbow of colorful fruit and vegetables. Why is that? Because these colors, the carotenoids from carrots, for example, which bring that beautiful orange hue to food items like carrots, are all rich in plant polyphenols, which bring back both anti-inflammatory impacts on our physical and most importantly our mental health, but also the antioxidants beat off oxidative stress in the body, which is one of those really landmark issues that we're dealing with in our everyday life. When people say, eat lots of antioxidants, what they're talking about is eating foods that beat off oxidative stress in the body, so that they are really fending off radical oxygen species that get set up in the body, which are the basis of many diseases. And that's why eating antioxidant-rich foods become important. So eating the color of the rainbow and plenty of fruit and vegetables are vital. Another vital thing to remember is that you can only get fiber from fruit, vegetables, beans, nuts, seeds, legumes, and healthy whole grains. You cannot get it from meat or animal animal or seafood proteins. So people need to just eat some balance of vegetables in their diet. Another important pillar is eating fermented foods. So kimchi, miso, kefir, tempeh, and several others like kombucha are important because what these foods do is they bring back good bacteria to the microbiome or the gut, to the gut. And by doing so, you are really feeding the good microbes in your gut and balancing off the condition and the environment in your gut. Now, I like to provide acronyms, and it's one of the best ways that I went through medical school. So just to touch on a quick thing in terms of stress, because it's one of the things that I think we're all dealing with. And by the way, I touched on some foods here. Each chapter of my book goes through different conditions. The foods to embrace are much longer than the foods to avoid. But I put together this mnemonic as a quick way to actually help people think about the ways to fend off stress. It turns out that super dark chocolate, the raw natural kind, more than 70%, and look for an unsweetened version, is rich in serotonin. Itself has cacao flavonols, which are excellent just for our brain health, again, rich in antioxidants. Also, super dark chocolate has magnesium, which helps with brain blood flow. So a small piece of super dark chocolate is always good for you. I would just say be cautious if you're eating it at night because it can keep you awake. Fermented foods, like I mentioned, the rainbow of veggies, like I touched on. Eat your berries is one of my favorites. Blueberries, blackberries, strawberries are some of my favorites because they are low glycemic fruit. Why does that become important? Because most of us in the United States have poor metabolic health, either slightly overweight or have some impairment in how we're eating based on our diet. And for that reason, I encourage people to eat 1 to 2 servings of fruit a day. But if you are struggling a little bit with your weight, start with berries because they are lower lower glycemic and will help you still get in the fiber and nutrients that you need from fruit, but manage your weight a little better and help your metabolic health until you reach a more normalized weight. Spices are an unspoken hero in this conversation because spices like turmeric, capsaicin, and chili peppers, oregano, thyme, so many of these contain amazing ingredients that have been shown in research to help certain mental health symptoms. I will touch on the fact that turmeric with a pinch of black pepper helps things like anxiety and depression. Saffron has been studied in randomized controlled trials of depression, and so many more. I will also just add that if you are new to using turmeric, add a pinch of black pepper, because the pinch of black pepper uses piperine from black pepper to activate the curcumin in turmeric and make it approximately 2000% more bioavailable to your brain and body. So, add it to a super smoothie or a tea, or if you cook with it, enjoy even more than a quarter teaspoon a day because it's good for you. And why do I say eat salads with lots of greens? Many of my patients might roll their eyes, but the reality is that the leafy greens are rich in folate, and folate is one of those nutrients that is important and vital to our brain. Studies have shown that low levels of folate are associated with fatigue, anxiety, depression, and other conditions. So just eating your greens and having a salad with multiple colors, but a basis on a bed of greens becomes so important. So those are just some tips to get people started. And the plan really for everyone is more of an individualized, personalized plan, depending on the uniqueness of your gut microbiome, speaking to your clinician about assuming a healthier diet, depending on where you're at in life, and remembering that it doesn't all happen at once. It's a stepwise, steady plan towards and a movement towards a healthier state of being. Thank you so much for your time, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Naidoo. That was an excellent presentation. So I'll ask you to join me on camera now.
Sure. Thank you.
We will open it up to questions. So everybody out there, if you have questions, please submit them. If you are watching us on Facebook Live, you can register at naturallyinformed.net to join in the presentation for Q&A now and to view the remainder of today's talks. So we are all more familiar now with nutritional psychiatry, thanks to Dr. Naidoo, but what was our familiarity before her talk? So let's see what we have here. 17% very familiar, 41% said they were somewhat familiar, and another 41% not familiar at all. So it's very good that we did this.
I love it.
Inform everyone on that. All right, and I do just want to say too, you touched a lot on burnout, which is such an important topic and a topic of great interest. And later on today, we are going to have a session dedicated to employee wellness, and we will have mental health advocates and human resource specialists joining us. So to everybody who's interested in hearing more about that, please join in for that session as well. Okay, so we do have questions coming in. This is such an interesting one, and it might be a case where the answer is more research is needed, but I'm just so curious. We were asked if processed foods and unhealthy foods have negative effects on the brain, why hasn't our body developed an aversion to those foods?
It's a great question, and I'm not sure why the body has not developed an aversion, but I would argue that it depends on what you call an aversion, because that disruption of the gut microbiome that I spoke about. And let me just frame this in the context of the fact that it's very hard in this modern day to avoid a processed food. So I'm not saying you have to drastically change your diet. In fact, I'm very much about careful and conservative change that helps someone truly with their emotional well-being. I would argue that, our gut does become inflamed. Our gut microbiome does get disrupted over time, because if that's all that you're eating, if your daily pretzels and potato chips or whatever maybe your favorite cookie or snack is that is highly processed, is something you eat every day, over time, and I spoke about the fact that most Americans have problems with metabolic health. It is because most individuals, and this is again not a judgment, it's reality of what we eat, are eating a standard American diet, which is high in processed foods. And our food system has largely been based on convenience. We're a very, very busy nation. And so we take all of that into account. And I would argue that maybe it's not called an adverse reaction or an aversion, but it is disrupting our gut, leading to those problems with inflammation, which is really considered to be a cause of one of the conditions underlying mental health problems and physical problems today.
That's an excellent point. Another question here from Melissa coming in. She said, I read your book and am very energized by your approach to mental wellness. What would be some of the most supportive products for your patients that don't exist currently, since dietary change can be tough?
I suppose, I would point to some of the current and ongoing research around what they're calling psychobiotics, which are basically how can you use the knowledge that we're learning that is ongoing about the microbiome to produce, instead of what we would call a traditional medication, such as Prozac or Zoloft or Paxil or any one of those, to impact change for mental well-being. And I would love to find a food source to do that. So is there a way to create a form of food to help the microbiome, but improve mental well-being over time, instead of just the traditional medications, which, while they are life-saving, have side effects and may not cure everyone, as we showed early on with the data.
We did, following up on probiotics, we were asked any suggested probiotic strains to support good mental health.
So you will find that, the research in my book outlines the studies that looked at specific strains, right? Because there are 100 trillion microbes in the gut. Studies have been done on some of them, and certainly the ones that are listed, where the studies are listed, you could look for those. But here's a general guidance around probiotics. Work with your physician or your practitioner, find one that works for you. If you're new to taking a probiotic, and now I'm talking about a supplement because there are fermented foods that can do the same. Sometimes it can be very stressful to just suddenly take a probiotic if you haven't been. So you might have to do it slowly. You might have to find a strain that works with you, which is why I'm suggesting go through your practitioner, even if you don't need a prescription. The second thing about it is you can also just start eating more fermented foods. Kimchi, kombucha, kefir, all of which you don't have to make from scratch. There are store-bought versions you can get. Just watch out for added sugars. Kombucha is a great fermented food, but sometimes has a ton of added sugar. So just look for it, and you can start there and then build your way towards a probiotic.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Thank you for all this information. Unfortunately, we are out of time for this talk, and we have a lot more questions that came in. So I encourage everyone to pick up Dr. Naidoo's book, which is This Is Your Brain on Food, and we do have the link for information up in the chat. And there's more information in the book. And also, she has graciously said, reach out to her on her website, and we'll keep the conversation going. And Dr. Naidoo, I thank you so much for your time today.